The air in the Alcázar of Madrid was thick and heavy on that suffocating morning in 1665. It was a palpable mixture of incense, the cloying scent of beeswax candles, and something darker, more primal, the metallic tang of blood-soaked rags. Behind heavy oak doors, the laboured cries of Queen Mariana of Austria echoed, a desperate soundtrack to a moment 2 centuries in the making. This was no ordinary birth. It was the biological culmination of a dynasty's calculated obsession, a genetic catastrophe meticulously engineered through generations. The child struggling to enter the world would be named Charles II of Spain, and his very body would be a living testament to the horrifying consequences of royal inbreeding pushed to its absolute limit. The courtiers whispering in the shadowed corridors knew the stakes. They served a queen who was both niece and wife to the dying King Philip IV, a union that defied nature in its pursuit of purity. The previous heirs had perished, their bodies too weak to cling to life. Now, the future of a global empire rested on the fragile shoulders of an unborn infant, the final, flawed product of the Habsburg family's grand and terrible design. To understand the magnitude of the tragedy unfolding in that Madrid palace, one must journey back to the origins of Habsburg ambition. The dynasty's rise from minor Swiss nobility to European titans was not forged by chance, but by a single, ruthless strategy. In the late 15th century, Emperor Maximilian I perfected a new kind of warfare, one waged not on battlefields but in marriage chambers. His motto became the family's guiding principle: Belligerant alii, tu Felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. This was not about romantic alliance. It was a cold, systematic program of power accumulation through selective breeding. While other kings spent their treasuries on armies, the Habsburgs spent theirs on dowries, securing duchies, kingdoms, and entire empires through the strategic exchange of their children. The strategy worked with breathtaking success. Through a series of meticulously arranged unions, the Habsburgs came to control a dominion so vast it was said the sun never set upon it. By the time Charles V inherited the throne in 1519, his realm stretched from Spain and the Netherlands to Austria, Naples, and the vast territories of the New World. The Habsburgs had become the masters of Europe, their power seemingly unassailable. Yet, even at this zenith of political power, the genetic foundation of their empire was beginning to splinter. Charles V himself was a product of this system, born from the union of Philip the Fair of Castile and Joanna the Mad, who were first cousins. The practice of keeping power within the family circle was already established, but it was Charles V's decision to divide his empire upon his abdication in 1556 that locked the dynasty onto its fatal course. He bequeathed the Spanish crown, its Italian possessions, and the wealthy Netherlands to his son, Philip II, and the Austrian hereditary lands, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor to his brother, Ferdinand I. This division created 2 separate but intimately linked branches of the Habsburg family, the Spanish and the Austrian, who would spend the next century intermarrying with a frequency that defied both medical and moral sense. It was Philip II of Spain who truly became the principal architect of the dynasty's genetic doom. A man of immense piety and rigid determination, he believed that to maintain Habsburg dominance, one must marry Habsburg blood. His first wife was his first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal. Her death in childbirth was a personal tragedy, but it did not deter him from the family strategy. After political marriages to Mary I of England and Elizabeth of Valois, Philip made his most fateful decision. At the age of 43, he married his niece, Anna of Austria, a girl of 20. Anna was the daughter of Philip's cousin, Emperor Maximilian II, making their relationship a tangled web of consanguinity. From this union of uncle and niece was born the future Philip III in 1578, a child who inherited not just a crown, but a significantly elevated coefficient of inbreeding, a mathematical measure of genetic risk that was climbing with each generation. The science of genetics was centuries away from being understood, but the consequences were already becoming visible. The infamous Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, began to emerge as a visible marker of the family's declining gene pool. This distinctive facial deformity, a severely protruding lower jaw that made speaking and eating difficult, resulted from the inheritance of identical recessive genes from both parents. In normal populations, these genes are masked by dominant alleles, but in a closed gene pool, they express themselves with increasing frequency and severity. Portraits from the era tell a silent, damning story. Early Habsburgs like Maximilian I show only a hint of the jaw. By the time of Charles V, it is clearly defined. In Philip II, it is pronounced, and in Philip III, it becomes a dominant, disfiguring feature. This jaw was more than a cosmetic oddity. It was the physical manifestation of a hidden genetic time bomb, ticking away through the generations, its countdown nearing zero in the person of the child about to be born to Philip IV and Mariana. The dynasty that had mastered Europe through marriage was now being strangled by the very ties that had once bound its power together. The birth of Philip III from the union of uncle and niece was not seen as a warning but as a success. The bloodline was preserved, the inheritance secured. When it came time for Philip III to marry, the Habsburgs, blinded by tradition and a fanatical devotion to their own blood, doubled down on their genetic gamble. In 1599, he married Margaret of Austria, a woman who was not only his first cousin but also connected to him through multiple other intricate family ties. Their relationship was so complex it defied simple description, a knotted thread in the already tangled Habsburg tapestry. This marriage amplified the genetic risks exponentially, as each shared ancestor increased the probability that their offspring would inherit 2 copies of harmful recessive genes. The child born from this intensified consolidation of the gene pool was Philip IV, who entered the world in 1605, carrying a heavier, more dangerous genetic burden than any of his predecessors. Philip IV's reign, which spanned from 1621 to 1665, was a period of dramatic contrast for Spain. It was an age of magnificent art and culture, the era of Velázquez, yet it also witnessed the empire's accelerating decline on the world stage. While economic mismanagement and costly wars were significant factors, the king's own deteriorating health and capacity, a direct consequence of his inbred ancestry, cast a long shadow over his rule. The Habsburg jaw, now a prominent and debilitating feature, made his speech difficult and slurred, impairing his communication with advisors and foreign ambassadors. He suffered from recurring bouts of illness, including seizures and chronic fatigue, which sapped his energy and focus during critical moments of state. The sun was setting on the Spanish Empire, and the man at the helm was increasingly too unwell to navigate the gathering storms. Yet, Philip IV's most catastrophic contribution to the Habsburg legacy was not a political edict or a lost battle, but another marriage. In 1649, the 4-year-old king took as his wife his own niece, the 5-year-old Mariana of Austria. Mariana was the daughter of Philip IV's sister, Maria Anna, and Emperor Ferdinand III, making Philip simultaneously her uncle, her first cousin once removed, and her relation through several other convoluted lines of descent. The arrangement was a stark demonstration of the family's cold, transactional view of marriage. Mariana had originally been intended for Philip IV's son, Balthasar Charles, but when the young prince died in 1646, she was simply reassigned to the father. The nearly 3-decade age gap was irrelevant. The imperative was to keep the power and the patrimony locked within the family circle, no matter the human cost. Queen Mariana, transported from the Austrian court to the suffocating formality of Madrid, was ill-equipped for her role. Described by contemporaries as frail, nervous, and prone to melancholy, she struggled under the immense weight of her duties and the grim reality of being a child bride to her own uncle. Her own health was precarious, and she exhibited symptoms of the same genetic weaknesses that plagued the dynasty, hints of the suffering that would be magnified in her offspring. The union was a desperate attempt to produce a healthy male heir, but the genetic odds were now catastrophically against them. The marriage yielded several pregnancies, but most ended in miscarriage or the early death of the infant. The one child who had briefly offered hope was a son, Philip Prospero, born in 1657. Hailed throughout Spain as the long-awaited heir, his life was a preview of the horror to come. From his first breath, he was sickly and weak. Court chronicles describe a boy who could barely walk, spoke with great difficulty, and was plagued by relentless seizures. His immune system was so compromised that he lived in a perpetual state of illness, his small body a battleground for every passing germ. His death in 1661 at just 4 years old plunged the Spanish court into a profound crisis of succession. The pressure on the young Queen Mariana after Philip Prospero's death was immense and unrelenting. The empire, its prestige fading and its treasury bleeding, desperately needed a stable succession. The entire political architecture of Europe waited with bated breath. The court physicians, priests, and advisors all turned their gaze upon the Queen, their collective hope and fear a palpable force. She had to produce another son. But the genetic dice were loaded. The coefficient of inbreeding for a child of Philip IV and Mariana was calculated by generations of unions between uncles and nieces. first and second cousins, a spiral of diminishing genetic returns. They were, in effect, rolling a genetic dice where every side was marked for disaster. The stage was now set for the final act of the Habsburg tragedy. In the royal bedchamber, as King Philip IV himself lay dying in a separate room, Queen Mariana labored to bring a new life into a world that had already doomed it. The child who would be named Charles II was not just a last hope. He was the living, breathing embodiment of his family's 200-year gamble, a final, desperate throw of the genetic dice. When the infant Charles II finally emerged from the birth chamber on the 6th of November 1665, a silence of dread fell over the attending physicians and midwives. The long and difficult labor had nearly claimed both mother and child, but the true horror was only revealed upon his arrival. This was not a healthy heir. This was a biological crisis made flesh. The new king of the vast Spanish Empire was a profoundly ill child from his first breath. His head was disproportionately large, his limbs were weak and spindly, and his facial features were grotesquely distorted. The Habsburg jaw, which had been a pronounced feature in his father and grandfather, had reached its terrifying apogee in Charles. His lower jaw protruded so far forward that his upper and lower teeth could not meet, creating a permanent, unsettling gape and making the simple, life-sustaining act of chewing solid food a physical impossibility. This was merely the most visible sign of a systemic collapse occurring within his tiny body. The physical deformities were only the beginning of Charles II's lifelong torment. His development was shockingly delayed, a clear indicator of severe cognitive impairment. He did not speak his first words until the age of 4, and even then, his speech was a garbled, nearly unintelligible mess, further mangled by his jaw deformity. The milestone of walking was not achieved until he was 8 years old, and even with assistance, his motor skills remained clumsy and uncoordinated throughout his life. He suffered from frequent and violent epileptic seizures that would leave him unconscious for hours, terrifying his court and fueling whispers of demonic possession. The medical knowledge of the 17th century was utterly unequipped to understand his condition. Court physicians, trained in humoral theory and superstition, blamed everything from an imbalance of the Queen's moods during pregnancy to divine punishment for the nation's sins or the malicious work of witches and evil spirits. They prescribed useless tonics, performed painful bleedings, and organized exorcisms, all while the true cause, a catastrophic genetic inheritance, remained a mystery to them. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree reveals the chilling scientific truth behind the tragedy. Charles II possessed an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. To understand this number is to understand the depth of the disaster. The child of a union between first cousins has a coefficient of 0.0625. The child of siblings has a coefficient of 0.25. Charles II was more inbred than if his own parents had been brother and sister. This extreme level of homozygosity meant he had inherited identical, faulty copies of recessive genes from both sides of his family at an unprecedented rate. Every harmful mutation that had accumulated and been silently carried through generations of Habsburgs for mandibular prognathism, for pituitary dysfunction, for mental disability, for kidney failure was expressed in his single, suffering body. He was less a king and more a museum of his dynasty's genetic errors. The Spanish court, trapped by protocol and pride, embarked on a monumental effort to maintain the fiction that their king was merely delicate. Official portraits were masterpieces of propaganda. Painters like Juan Carreño de Miranda were instructed to soften the king's most grotesque features, depicting him with a still prominent but less severe jaw, his body swathed in luxurious fabrics to hide its frailty, and a faint, regal expression where there was often vacant confusion. Court ceremonies were meticulously choreographed to minimize his participation and hide his limitations. Foreign ambassadors were given strict instructions on how to interact with him to keep conversations simple, to avoid sudden movements, and to never, ever comment on his appearance or behavior. Yet, despite these efforts, the truth could not be contained. Whispers and detailed diplomatic reports leaked out of the Alcazar, spreading throughout the chancelleries of Europe. They described a monarch who drooled uncontrollably, who was prone to bizarre, childlike outbursts, and whose attempts at speech were often reduced to incomprehensible grunts and sounds. The King of Spain, they murmured, was less a man and more a monstrous creature, a living ghost haunting his own palace. The gulf between the majestic image projected by the state and the heartbreaking reality of the man was the central, unspoken tragedy of his reign. As Charles II entered adolescence, the most pressing crisis of his reign became the question of succession. The king needed an heir to secure the dynasty, but his profound physical and mental disabilities made the very concept of fatherhood a near impossibility. The Spanish court thus embarked on a series of international marriage negotiations that became elaborate exercises in deception and desperation. The goal was to secure a fertile bride from a powerful allied family without revealing the full, horrifying extent of the king's incapacities. In 1679, when Charles was 14, a union was finalized with Marie-Louise of Orleans, a young, vibrant and healthy French princess, and the niece of the Sun King Louis XIV. She was everything Charles was not, and their wedding was a spectacle of tragic contrasts. The teenage bride, renowned for her beauty and spirit, was visibly terrified, while the king, barely able to stand through the ceremony without the support of his attendants, seemed bewildered and disconnected from the event unfolding around him. The marriage was doomed from its first day. The consummation was delayed for months, and likely never successfully occurred. Marie-Louise's private letters to her family in France provide a heartbreaking window into the surreal nightmare of her life. She described her husband as a pitiable figure, more dead than alive, incapable of holding a coherent conversation or participating in the simplest courtly pleasures. She wrote of his constant drooling, his sudden and violent seizures, and his habit of speaking in fragmented, unintelligible sentences that no one could understand. Most tragically, she confessed her growing certainty, year after childless year, that the king was physiologically incapable of fathering a child. For a decade, she lived in a gilded cage, her health and spirit deteriorating under the immense strain of her impossible role. Her sudden death in 1689 at the age of 26 was widely suspected to be an assassination by poisoning, but modern historians largely agree she likely succumbed to appendicitis, her body and mind broken by a decade of profound unhappiness and psychological torment. Charles's second marriage, to Maria Anna of Neuburg in 1690, was an act of even greater desperation. This German princess was chosen for her family's reputed fertility, but the outcome was the same. Maria Anna's accounts depict a king whose mental state was deteriorating into severe paranoia and obsessive-compulsive disorder. He developed elaborate rituals around his food, convinced he was the target of poisoners, and would fly into violent rages if his rigid daily routines were disrupted. He would spend hours staring at his own reflection in mirrors, seemingly fascinated by the distorted features that made him a monster in the eyes of the world. This isolation was not just personal, it was political. With a king who was effectively non-functional, the Spanish government entered a state of paralysis. Real power devolved to competing factions of nobles and ministers who governed around the monarch, not through him. The court became a theatre of the absurd, where elaborate state banquets were held for a king who could not chew his food, and complex policy debates were held in the presence of a ruler who could not comprehend them. This power vacuum at the heart of the empire had devastating consequences. Corruption became endemic, as officials with no fear of royal oversight lined their own pockets. The Spanish military, once the terror of Europe, suffered from neglect and poor leadership, losing key battles and territories to the French and their other rivals. The economy, already fragile, spiraled into deeper crisis as trade routes faltered and colonial revenues were squandered. Internationally, Spain was no longer a power to be feared, but a prize to be won. Every court in Europe watched the macabre spectacle in Madrid, their ambassadors sending back detailed reports on every cough, every seizure, every sign of the king's decline. The War of the Spanish Succession was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, and the great powers France, Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic began to openly maneuver, forming alliances and positioning their armies. The fate of the Spanish Empire was no longer in the hands of its king, but in the hands of foreign diplomats and generals who were simply waiting for the sick man in the Alcazar to finally die. The final years of Charles II were a protracted and agonizing descent. By his mid-30s, the man who was the king of a global empire was a spectral figure, haunting his own palace. His body, ravaged by a lifetime of genetic disorders, aged with horrific rapidity. He appeared decades older than he was, emaciated, with thinning white hair and a grey, sickly pallor. The Habsburg jaw, now a grotesque caricature of its former self, dominated his face, making the simple act of swallowing a dangerous ordeal. He existed on a grim diet of broths and porridges, choking frequently, requiring constant supervision even to eat. His seizures intensified, striking multiple times a day and leaving him unconscious for hours, each episode sending ripples of panic through a court and a continent waiting for him to die. His mind, always fragile, retreated further into a prison of paranoia and religious mania. He became convinced he was cursed by witchcraft and spent enormous sums on exorcists, surrounding himself with religious relics, and engaging in hours of frantic, desperate prayer, seeking a divine cure for a biological fate. The autopsy performed after his death on the 1st of November 1700 provided a chilling scientific post-mortem. The physicians, who had been baffled by his condition in life, discovered the physical truth in death. They found his heart was unnaturally small, his lungs were corroded, and his intestines were putrefied and gangrenous. Most tellingly, they noted that his head was full of water and that he had a single atrophied testicle. In the crude medical language of the day, they described his body as containing not a single drop of blood. While their terminology was pre-scientific, their observations were stark. Every major organ was deformed, underdeveloped, or corrupted. His brain was smaller than normal, his digestive system was malformed, and his reproductive organs confirmed what his 2 marriages had proven: he was sterile, the biological dead end of his line. The last Spanish Habsburg was, from his first breath to his last, a non-viable organism, the final product of a genetic experiment that had consumed itself. With Charles's death, the dynastic time bomb detonated. He had left a will naming Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir, but this only ignited the powder keg that had been prepared for decades. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted immediately, a devastating continent-wide conflict that raged for 13 years, drawing in all the major powers and costing hundreds of thousands of lives. While the war eventually placed a Bourbon king on the Spanish throne, its true outcome was the final dismantling of the Habsburg global empire. Spain's European possessions were carved up, and its status as a dominant world power was irrevocably broken. The dynasty that had built its supremacy through marriage had, in the end, been utterly destroyed by it. The legacy of Charles II, however, extended far beyond politics and war. His tragic life and horrifying death served as a gruesome but undeniable cautionary tale for the royal houses of Europe. The visible, tangible evidence of the Habsburgs' self-inflicted genetic collapse forced a slow but seismic shift in aristocratic marriage practices. While unions for political advantage continued, the extreme, multi-generational inbreeding that had characterized the Habsburgs began to fall out of favor. The lesson was written in Charles's deformed body and sterile lineage. Purity of blood, when pursued too fanatically, leads not to strength, but to extinction. The story of the queen who birthed a monster is not one of supernatural horror, but of human hubris. It is the story of a family so intoxicated with its own power that it believed it could defy the fundamental laws of nature, only to discover that those laws are the most absolute monarchs of all. Thank you for following this tragic and fascinating story from history. If you've been captivated by the rise and fall of the Habsburg dynasty, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history's hidden truths. Let me know in the comments what other doomed dynasties or genetic mysteries you'd like us to explore next.